Good to see you, Brian McGowan, Dr. Brian McGowan. Thanks for talking to the OnSurge again today. Tell me about our classic textbooks. Why are they still considered the standard against which we compare new resources, and are they a good gold standard?
They were for 300 years. There is a hurdle, a huge mountainous hurdle when it comes to books and evolving beyond books, simply because of the familiarity we all have with them, especially when you think about complicated texts, the profession specialty defining textbooks, Brunwald's cardiology, same in surgery, I'm sure, same in dentistry. We have these textbooks that are on their 20th or 25th versions. And they've slowly been collecting and pulling together all the information that's fit to print within that specialty, which the device, having a place, a centralized place where all the information lives, makes total sense. There's a lot of benefit in that. My first thought is whether any book could actually capture all of the information, either within one specialty. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe the first challenge to whether books are gold standards is ask yourself whether you think the best text that's ever been written in the medical profession, is that capturing 90% of what's need to be known, or is that capturing 10%?
Yeah.
And that may fundamentally just change whether you see or the amount of value you place in those texts.
And how about just the way they were constructed? It seems more that they are constructed by some convention than by some principle of education.
They're constructed based on the book convention, right? So chapter by chapter, building block by building block, and increasingly over the last 100 some years, right? They've been, especially the medical texts, have been constructed by delegation. So Chris, I'm interested in a chapter on X, and I want you to write it. You can bring a couple people to the table. And Brian, you're going to write a chapter on Y, and then we're going to have Joel write a chapter on Z. And why are they the right 12 chapters? There's really no evidence-based planning behind that, especially after the first edition's out, right? So from there on, it's just an evolution of the status quo. Books in and of themselves give you a starting place, they give you an ending place, and maybe they give you a table of contents and an index. But in any other realm of information management, a book fails. It fails to pass muster. It doesn't allow you to search effectively. You're putting almost all of your faith in the editor or the editors as it relates to the credibility of the information in that book. Referencing, right? So there is no crowd. There is no ability to peer review en masse to actually understand what is or isn't working. A textbook that's out, version 13 of the physiology textbook, and 3 years later, you find out that version 15's been published. It's medical physiology. There certainly is some late-breaking research, but 99% of what we know about medical physiology hasn't changed in the last 2 years.
So you have to purchase the book, and then you have to figure out what part of that book is new.
Yeah. At some point, you have to ask yourself whether the convention of medical knowledge and medical wisdom being contained within this thing we call a book is a broken convention. And you can try to fix it. There's certainly new textbooks. E-books are certainly a step in the right direction. But the textbook that you and I train with, that many of our colleagues still use today, those textbooks at best are where you would go to find things that happened 5 years ago. There's a quote, I like to attribute it to Joe Lex, He's a local Philadelphia physician. I think it's Joe Lex5 on Twitter. It's actually in the opening acknowledgments of the book I wrote a couple years ago. And paraphrasing, it goes something like, if you want to know about what's happened in medicine 5 years ago, read a book. If you want to know what's happening in medicine 2 years ago, read a journal article. If you want to know what's happening now, attend your annual meeting. But if you want to know where medicine's going, you have to remain open to your social graph. And it's cute, it's trite, but it's largely accurate.
Yeah, yeah. Just speaking of your book, that's Social QI, right?
Yeah, Social QI, simple solutions for improving your healthcare.
And a lot I love that book.
Thanks. It's gotten some really nice feedback. It has to do with information management. So how does information flow? So while the book focused a lot on new technology and social media, I don't really think that's at the heart of your questions today, but it certainly is where I spend most of my time thinking and my research. So I've been doing research over the last few years around how people learn and how we structure information from the moment it's presented to us. So whether it's at point of care and you made a mistake and you receive feedback, either pointed mentoring feedback or feedback in terms of fear or embarrassment. These are all key milestones in our professional careers. And what do we do with that information if you're in a plenary session or engaging with content online, or you look something up in a table of contents in a book or in a journal, and you answer a question in a moment? Do we really believe that that simple question and answer process that we each take on maybe a dozen times a week, do we believe that that process, simply finding the right answer, is going to lead to performance or behavior changes? Or is there some other supportive structure that each of us as learners or as educators are responsible for building so that we can create bridges from those moments where you first pick up a nugget of information at the bedside or in a classroom or in a journal, and then some kind of supportive or space structure over time so that it becomes part of the way we see the world. It then becomes validated by different decisions that we make and eventually becomes not only a behavior or procedural change that we take on, but eventually even to a habit, right? I think there's a classic saying that knowing isn't doing. And that is maybe one of the most critical things for educators or clinicians as learners to accept. But I might extend it, right? Knowing isn't doing, and doing isn't habit. And for us to truly get to the point where new procedures, new decisions that we're making in practice don't feel new, right? To have the confidence in new decisions, to have the confidence in new behaviors, there's a lot more work that goes into it. And so, you may go from knowing to doing, and then doing to habit, right? We're talking these huge steps. And by and large, in your practice, when you're in the OR, when you're scrubbed in, I don't want you thinking about how you're going to learn. I don't want that to be an explicit thought. How am I learning? What pieces of information? What journal did I find this in? What textbook did I find it in? I want to make sure that by the time you've put those gloves on, you've got mastery of all the information that's required for that procedure.
Yeah. Let me ask you, if you were asked to redesign, if you were given all the content in the latest cardiac physiology book and said, this class has to learn all this content, would you just hand them the book and tell them to read this? Or what are some, just off the top of your head, some better ways to deliver that same content?
So it's almost as if you're painting a scenario that is preparing for a test versus a scenario which is preparing preparing for practice. There is, over the last 131 years, a growing school of evidence around how we forget information, dating back to Ebbinghaus in 1885, when he would study nonsense syllables and see how long he could remember them before he forgot them. And then a couple days later, he'd test himself again. So the idea of forgetting curves and retrieval has been studied for 131 years, I think, if my math's right. Over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been much more rigorous science applied to it. The issue is that science is always applied within a framework of someone preparing for a test. So if I were to present you with a glossary of 1,000 Spanish words and told you that in 6 months I was going to test you on 1,000 Spanish words, and your competency as a Spanish-speaking second language individual is going to be determined on your grade, then I could help you put a plan in place from now until 6 months from now to prepare. My guess is that plan would be very different than if I didn't tell you there was a test in 6 months and I basically said, you're a surgeon and there's a lot that you need to know to be a surgeon, and how are you going to structure your lifelong learning so that you are constantly troubleshooting your deficiencies and optimizing your competence. And so it in some people, I think, oversimplify to this limited knowledge base, you're going to take a test type mentality. And I think that you could look at that science for some support, but that's not what's going to make you the most proficient surgeon you are, or the most proficient cardiologist one could be. So if I had all the information available and I'm not focused on preparing somebody for a test, then the first thing I'm focused, my first step is accessibility. Right? I want to take all that knowledge that's there and I want to make it accessible. And I want to make it accessible for an individual so that they can find it, search through it, and navigate it very, very efficiently. Does a textbook work for any of those first questions? Right? No. So I want to take all the medical knowledge, I want to make it accessible, I want to make it searchable, and I want to make it intuitive. Now I want to structure that knowledge in a way that presents some type of prioritization to that knowledge. So what should you know first? What do 99% of clinicians need to know in practice versus where do the zebras lie? So if I can take all that knowledge and now begin to structure it, take all that information and begin to structure it, then not only is it accessible, navigatable, and intuitive, but you as an individual coming to that knowledge set can have some confidence that someone who knows maybe more than you, or someone who has greater expertise in this area, has structured and prioritized all that evidence. And that's really, really important. In fact, I would bet you that most folks open the book, and especially if it's got a little superscript number at the end of the sentence, that sentence right there is taken as gospel, right? It's in a book that was edited by one of the world's leading urologists, and it has a sentence, and that sentence, if you look in the references, says it was published in New England Journal of Medicine. I think most of us would stop thinking at that point, and for good cause. I mean, if you had to validate every single data point that you ever read in a book or in a journal article, if you had to ask a question whether it was a reproducible phenomenon or whether the appropriate statistical test was applied, you'd be paralyzed very, very quickly before you even decided whether the incision should be this way or this way. You'd realize that they've probably not been tested in a randomized clinical trial.
So actually what you just identified is the process we go through when trying to choose online resources, and we teach ourselves, or we are aware that we are vetting the information all the time. When we Google diverticulitis, oh, where's this coming from? Whereas we believed we didn't have to do that, or we got accustomed to just trusting the test books previously.
Yes. Yeah. The idea of, and this has actually played a lot in the last 4 or 5 years with the emergence of new technology and the lack of crowdsourcing and, well, the growth of crowdsourcing and the lack of hierarchy, right? This is where you and I first met, is that all of a sudden you have a level playing field, and Eric Topol could be having a conversation with Bob medical students. And, public research that was being done was being shared before it was peer reviewed. Now, in some professions, that is expected, right? In physics and mechanical engineering, proof of concept papers, preliminary drafts are shared immediately. And the community has to decide whether it passed tests of rigor and credibility. And then so you get this kind of crowdsourced peer review appreciation of what's important. And while, thumbs up and thumbs down seems like something in a smiley face or a love emoji on Facebook seem to be something that popular culture's accepting, that same type of crowdsourcing 4-star, 5-star ratings of publications could cut years off of the time between discovery and majorative best practices, right? We have this data we talk about, 17 years between discovery and best practice implementation. About the first 7 to 9 years of that is discovery. And then the last 7 to 9 years is the clinicians, clinical inertia and guideline publication, and then even systems-based at the end. And is it available? Is it on formulary? Is it payable? But if we could figure out a way to just make the information more available, then we could cut that timeline in half. But your point is well appreciated, right? That puts the validation and the credibility determination into the hands of the masses versus simply expecting that it's in New England Journal or it's in JAMA, therefore it's been peer reviewed, or it's in a textbook there. It's peer review of specialists peer reviewing each other's work has supported the medical profession, basic science, for the better part of 100 years.
We talked recently about some of the flaws of that peer review process, and that's a process that we put a great deal of trust into as well.
Yeah, I recently I've had the opportunity to be on a couple peer review panels for journals, for meetings, even for awards. And as someone who thinks about this all the time, watching what happens and how a set of reviewers can be asked to function anonymously, right? That's one approach. Then there's reviewers that are not functioning anonymously, and then there's reviewers that are given information that is or is not anonymous, and then there's review processes that are consensus building, and each one of them has flaws, and there are experts in this process, but I've seen very few expert processes. So just the other week,
that's a good one to break down for another day. We'll talk about that.
I'd love to dig into that. I think I'd have to learn a lot more before I figured out what the right answer is. Right now, I've just got a sense of worry.
So tell me just last few words on the book. The future. What's the future of the book?
Well, ebooks, I guess, are here now, and they dramatically cut down the costs, and they've brought forward a lot more flexibility. And they're more navigatable, and they're more intuitive, so you can move between different sections and more readily gain access to information. But they're still so rigidly structured to what we've done over the last 300 to 400 years. I think the future is much more in keeping with something like the Wikipedia model. I mean, which has now been around for 10 or 15 years in and of itself, right? So in the Wikipedia model, where there are classes of reviewers and it's crowdsourced, there's, especially when it's focused. And same thing, there was just an article you and I shared a couple days ago around specialty search engines. And so someplace in there, I think, is the future. It is about accessibility. It's about being intuitive. It's about navigation, and it's about crowdsourcing. And I think the solution, someplace in that mix of new science, is going to be a product that is infinitely more powerful than a book.
Yeah. Thanks for talking again.
My pleasure. Thanks for chatting, Chris.
See ya. Thanks for checking out the Op Report. Help us keep conversations alive on topics in general surgery. Check out more episodes of the Op Report and other OnSurge content here at YouTube. Find us at Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and find our homepage at onsurge.com. Join the conversation and tell us what topics you'd like to hear about and what people you'd like to hear from.